Somewhere around 12,000 years ago, a human being did something that changed the entire course of history. They didn't build a weapon, they didn't discover fire, they didn't sail across an ocean. They pushed a seed into the ground, and then they waited. That single act, planting something on purpose and coming back to check on it, was one of the most radical decisions any human has ever made. Because before that moment, no human on Earth had ever done it. For the previous 300,000 years of human existence, every single person who had ever lived was a hunter or a gatherer. They moved, they followed food, they took what nature offered and kept moving. And then, in a stretch of land in the Middle East that historians now call the Fertile Crescent, something changed. But here's the part most people never stop to think about. Nobody decided to invent farming. There was no meeting, no plan, no moment where a group of ancient humans sat down and said, "Let's stop moving and grow our own food instead." Farming didn't get invented. It got discovered, slowly, accidentally, over generations, by people who had no idea what they were starting. So how did it actually happen? The first clue comes from something archaeologists noticed about ancient garbage. At sites across the Middle East dating back 20,000 years or more, researchers started finding something unexpected in the remains of ancient camps. Large quantities of wild grain, not just a little. Enough to suggest that ancient hunter-gatherers were already collecting wild seeds and grasses in serious amounts, grinding them into flour and eating them regularly. Long before anyone planted anything, humans were already paying close attention to plants, watching them, learning them, understanding which ones were worth coming back for. And here's where it gets interesting. Wild grain doesn't just stay where you find it. When you harvest it, some of it falls. When you carry it back to camp, some of it drops along the way. And grain that falls on disturbed ground, ground that's been walked on, camped on, dug up, tends to grow faster and thicker than grain out in the wild. Ancient humans almost certainly noticed this. The places where they camped, where they processed grain, where they discarded the parts they didn't need, those places started growing more grain the next season. They didn't plan that, but they noticed it. And noticing it was everything. This is what researchers now call the pre-agricultural transition, a period of thousands of years where humans were semi-accidentally encouraging plant growth without fully committing to farming. They were returning to the same places, clearing competing plants away from the grasses they wanted, carrying seeds back to familiar spots. Not farming yet, but not fully nomadic either. Something in between. For thousands of years, this knowledge kept building. Season after season, generation after generation, humans were quietly learning what plants needed, what soil responded to, what made a good harvest more likely. The understanding was growing even before the crops were. And then the climate changed. Around 12,000 years ago, a period called the Younger Dryas ended. A cold, dry stretch that had made wild food scarce and unpredictable for over 1,000 years. When the climate warmed and stabilized, plant growth exploded across the Fertile Crescent, and the humans who had spent generations learning which plants responded to human attention suddenly found themselves in a landscape that rewarded that attention more than ever before. The conditions were right. The understanding was deep enough, and in a handful of locations across the Middle East, and independently, slightly later in China, in Mesoamerica, in Africa, humans made the final step. They started choosing where seeds went, on purpose, and staying to protect them. Farming had begun, not with a plan, with a habit. But starting to farm and actually making it work were two very different things. Because the first farmers didn't just plant seeds and walk away, they had to figure out almost everything from scratch. Which plants were worth growing? Which soil worked best? When did you plant? How much water did a crop need? How long did you wait before harvesting? None of this knowledge existed. They had to build it, one season at a time. The earliest domesticated crops tell an interesting story about how that process worked. Wild wheat and barley, the first grains humans started farming in the Middle East, look very different from the versions ancient farmers eventually developed. Wild wheat has seeds that shatter and fall to the ground easily. That's how the plant spreads itself in nature. But for a farmer, that's a problem. You want seeds that stay on the stalk until you harvest them. Over generations, ancient farmers kept seeds from the plants that held together longest, planted those, kept the best seeds from the next harvest, and planted those. They weren't doing genetics. They didn't know what genetics was, but they were doing exactly what genetics does, selecting for traits that worked better for them, generation after generation, until the plant itself changed. This process took hundreds of years, thousands in some cases, and the people doing it never saw the full result. They just kept saving the best seeds and planting them again. Their children did the same, and their children's children. Slowly across more generations than any one person could count, wild plants became domesticated crops. But farming changed more than just the plants. It changed the people too. and not always in ways that were immediately obvious. Here's something most people find genuinely surprising. The first farmers were, by almost every physical measure, worse off than the hunter-gatherers who came before them. Shorter, sicker, more prone to disease, more likely to experience famine. Hunter-gatherers ate a wide variety of foods, dozens of different plants, multiple animal species, varied nutrition across seasons. Early farmers ate mostly whatever they grew, and if the harvest failed, they starved in ways that nomadic groups almost never did, because nomadic groups could always move toward food somewhere else. Farming tied people to a place, and places could fail. So why did they keep doing it? Why didn't early farmers just go back to hunting and gathering when things got hard? The honest answer is that by the time the cost became clear, it was already too late to go back. Farming communities grew faster than hunter-gatherer groups. More stable food supply, even an imperfect one, meant more children surviving. More children meant more people to work the land. More people meant the group needed more land under cultivation. The momentum of farming, once it started, was almost impossible to reverse. Not because it was obviously better, but because it changed the size and structure of communities faster than those communities could choose to undo it. Farming didn't spread because people decided it was a good idea. It spread because communities that farmed grew larger than communities that didn't, and larger communities, over time, simply displaced smaller ones. And somewhere in that process, in those early, difficult, uncertain seasons of planting and waiting and losing crops and trying again, something else was happening too. Permanent villages were forming. People were building things meant to last longer than a season. Storage pits, granaries, eventually walls. The surplus that farming created, even an unreliable surplus, made specialization possible. Not everyone had to spend every day finding food. Some people could make tools, some could trade, some could keep track of what was grown and stored. And that's when everything accelerated, because keeping track required symbols. Symbols became writing. Writing made it possible to pass knowledge across generations without anyone having to remember it. And once knowledge could be stored outside the human mind, there was no ceiling on how much of it could exist. That farmer, the one who pushed a seed into the ground 12,000 years ago and waited, had no idea. They were just watching the dirt, hoping the rains would hold and the birds wouldn't take the seeds and there would be enough to eat when the season turned. They planted wheat. But what actually grew slowly across thousands of years of seasons and harvests and children and choices was everything that came after. Every city, every library, every word you have ever read. It started with a seed and someone patient enough to wait.